Professor Van-Tam, welcome to the inquiry. Let me explain the arrangements to you. You're talking to a rather more sizable audience than those that you see in front of you, not numerous as they are. They are largely participants and core participants in the inquiry. On your left, there are lawyers who represent various different interests in the inquiry. And on the back left of the room, there are representatives of the press. But beyond this room, there is a more sizable audience. It won't be quite as sizable, perhaps, as some of those you've been used to in recent years, who will be watching on YouTube or on live stream. And that'll number somewhere in 3 figures. The questions will be asked once you have been sworn by Mary in a moment or two by Miss Richards. Mary.
Please state your full name.
I am Jonathan Stafford, in Van-Tam.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Professor Van-Tam, I'm just going to start with a brief overview of your career to date. You graduated in medicine in 1987 and spent around 5 years working in various fields of clinical medicine in hospitals.
Yes, that is correct.
You then switched to, or shifted to an academic focus on public health and epidemiology, and your particular interest over the years has been influenza and respiratory viruses.
It has.
You became a lecturer, senior lecturer at the University of Nottingham in 1997, and then I think in around 2000 you joined the pharmaceutical industry for several years.
Yes, I became a lecturer in 1991 and progressed through public health training into a consultant role, which was a clinical senior lecturer post in 1997. And indeed, after just over 2 years in that role, I made a move to the pharmaceutical industry until 2004.
And then in 2004, you returned to the public sector and you worked at the Health Protection Agency, dealing with, in particular, issues relating to pandemic influenza.
Yes, that's right. I returned to the Centres for Disease Control at Colindale. That was my main focus, but I was also on call nationally for the whole range of infectious disease threats.
You then returned to the University of Nottingham as a Professor of Health Protection, and over the years that followed, you have been a member of a number of different committees and working groups. I'll just mention 2 for current purposes. You have been a member of the UK Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE, and a member and indeed chair of the new and emerging Respiratory Virus Threat Advisory Group, known as NERVTAG.
Yes, that's right. I've had 2 separate periods serving on SAGE. The first was during the 2009 to 2010 swine flu pandemic, and the second period was obviously recently in relation to the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic.
In late 2017, you took up a role as Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and I'll ask you more about that in due course. I think you describe it in your CV as being seconded to the Department of Health and Social Care for that purpose. How did that come about?
Yes, so the post was advertised and it was available either, I think, as a direct appointment for somebody who wished to join the civil service, but it was also available on a secondment basis for somebody with the right qualifications and experience who was already employed elsewhere and who perhaps had an expectation that they would return to that place, which is exactly what I have done. And throughout my tenure as Deputy Chief Medical Officer, I have been on a seconded basis and have remained at all times an employee of the University of Nottingham.
You've now stepped back from the role as Deputy Chief Medical Officer and your current role is Pro-Vice-Chancellor, the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at the University of Nottingham.
Yes, that's correct. I stepped back from the DCMO role at the end of March this year, and after a short pause to take breath, began as the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, and I look after the School of Medicine, the School of Health Sciences, the School of Life Sciences, and the School of Veterinary Medicine and Science.
And is your work currently now entirely or predominantly in the field of education, or do you still work clinically?
I only work clinically as an NHS COVID vaccinator. I do have another role as a non-executive director on Lincolnshire Integrated Care Board, and my role at the university is really a large leadership role. I continue to be active in science publication, but mainly in areas related to COVID-19 vaccination.
And you describe in your CV your role on the NHS Lincolnshire Integrated Care Board, the non-executive director role, as an advisory and challenge role. What does that entail?
Yes. So with the formation of the new integrated care boards, we want to move into a situation nationally where care provided by different agencies is brought together in a much more holistic way to deal with big public health questions. And as a non-executive director, it's my role with my colleagues and through the chair to garner the experience we have to kind of direct and bring about the integration of those services, but also where necessary to offer robust challenge to particular parts of the health service, different provider organisations about what it is extra or different that they could do.
Now, before we turn to the various issues that the inquiry has asked you to reflect on, I just want to, for the benefit of those listening, really just contextualise the evidence you're going to give.
Yes.
The inquiry at this stage of its hearings has been looking at the current public health landscape. It's heard, for example, from Dr. Rain at the MHRA, Dr. Hopkins at the UKHSA,
yes,
and a range of others involved in public health currently. And what I'm going to be asking you about, Professor, is for your perspective as someone involved at a very senior level in the public health field, within the Department of Health, on decision-making in general.
Yes.
But I think it's important to emphasise you're not giving evidence on behalf of the Department of Health or on behalf of the Chief Medical Officer's role. You're giving evidence as an individual.
Yes. And I wonder if it's helpful or not to point out to the inquiry that during the time of my junior doctor jobs in the first 5 years of my career, I did spend 6 months working on the infectious diseases unit in Leicester at a time when we had really quite sizable numbers of patients admitted with newly diagnosed HIV. And it was, of course, in an era when there were no effective treatments available, very much different from the circumstance we find today. But I guess it is contextually relevant, perhaps, to point out to you that I have had that experience, albeit in a very different and rather more challenging era.
And again, just for the benefit of those listening, I'm not going to be asking you specifically about decisions made in relation to the COVID pandemic. There is a separate public inquiry looking at that, and Professor, you'll no doubt be invited to give evidence in due course to that. But obviously, as we discuss issues more generally, please feel free to draw on whatever experience seems to you to be relevant in responding to questions. And also, I think relevant to point out, you've not been involved specifically in any decision-making regarding the infected blood products and the response of government to those matters.
I have not.
So I want to turn to the first of the issues that we asked you to reflect on, which is the role of the Chief Medical Officer and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer. Just as a matter of fact, during your time as DCMO, the Chief Medical Officer to start with was Sally Davis, now Dame Sally Davis.
Yes.
And then she was succeeded by Professor Chris Whitty.
That's correct.
How many Deputy Chief Medical Officers were there during your time at the department?
So when I first came into post, there were 2 Deputy Chief Medical Officers, and I gather that prior to me being in post, there'd been a similar arrangement. And one DCMO was responsible for, broadly speaking, health improvement, and the other one was responsible for health protection, which is the control of communicable diseases, the response to chemical, nuclear, biological and radiation hazards, the territory that has typically been occupied by the Health Protection Agency, then Public Health England, and now the UK Health Security Agency. And I was in the I occupied one of the 2 posts, and my post was the Health Protection post. So I was only very peripherally involved in kind of broader public health subjects, obesity, smoking, etc., which had not really been the focus of my specific public health training for a very long while, because I had made a very clear decision early on in my public health training that it was the communicable disease control side of the business that I was really interested in.
And can you give us a sense of the size of and structure of the Chief Medical Officer's, Deputy Chief Medical Officer's office within the Department of Health?
Yes.
Roughly how many staff work there?
So I don't think it's fair to say that the Deputy Chief Medical Officer has an office, as much as the Deputy Chief Medical Officer is part of the Chief Medical Officer's office. And I recall that in my early days, there was myself, there was the other DCMO, there was Dame Sally, and there would be a team of private secretaries, probably numbering, I think, about 4 or 5, and a team of administrative staff, probably of the same kind of number.
And were there any other medical staff within the office?
The physicians in the office were myself, Dr. Radford, the other DCMO, and Dame Sally.
Could you give us your understanding of the role and responsibilities of the Chief Medical Officer and his or her deputies?
Yes, I can. So my understanding and how I saw it kind of lived out in terms of day-to-day conduct, in terms of the role of the Chief Medical Officer, was that the Chief Medical Officer was undoubtedly the most senior source of advice on matters related to clinical medicine for the Department of Health, which became the Department of Health and Social Care, and also for the wider UK government based in Whitehall. On top of that, it was very clear that symbolically, and in the case of Professor Sir Chris Whitty, by training, he occupied the CMO position, occupies the head of the public health apparatus in the UK, or at least in England. And the other role that I think came across very clearly at certain points with both Dame Sally and with Sir Chris was that they rightly very much framed themselves as the head of the medical profession in the UK.
A chief medical officer, a deputy chief medical officer, clearly can't be expert in every area of medicine. No. So when information is needed in areas which do not fall within the particular knowledge and expertise of the CMO or DCMOs, how do you go about getting it?
Could you rephrase that question, please?
Yes.
So is it how does the CMO get the information,
yes,
or how do I?
Well, how would the CMO's office, so embracing the CMO, the DCMO,
yes,
how would they get information and expert input?
Yes. So, I mean, the whole point of the CMO having deputies is that they can reach into certain areas and have a bit more time and a bit more bandwidth to reach into certain areas. And sometimes there'll be areas where the CMO is already familiar, but areas where they are not so familiar, and that will depend upon their own clinical training that brought them to the office they're holding. And that's why there was this very clear distinction between a DCMO for health protection and a DCMO for health improvement, to make sure that all of the bases in relation to public health practice were covered. But you're quite right that the CMO office as a whole couldn't be expected at any moment to be experts in everything. Now, with the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, the impression that we were experts was driven, perhaps fortuitously, perhaps by design, by the fact that Professor Sir Chris is trained both as an infectious diseases physician and a public health person, and I happened to have been trained as a public health person, but with a very deep expertise in respiratory viruses and respiratory virus vaccines. So perhaps that, looked good, if you see what I mean, because the right people were lined up in the right places. But that isn't always going to be the case. And when it is not, you rely on your very deep connections with, at the time for me it was Public Health England, it became the UK Health Security Agency, through the PHE Medical Director or the UK HSA Medical Director, who I think you've heard from. You rely on those connections to get you to the right people very rapidly within the Public Health England UK HSA empire, who are the kind of deep area specialists in a particular field. And those people would often reside where I used to work at the, what was then the CDSC, Colindale, that part of the Health Protection Agency, or UK HSA. That's where most of the kind of deep subject area specialists live. But there really is this kind of ongoing relationship with those individuals by subject area, and the ability to reach in very rapidly and get advice. Now, on top of that, depending upon the particular field, there are a whole range of government expert advisory committees who are set up to meet on a regular basis, usually at what I would describe as a kind of peacetime pace, to consider matters, keep an eye on a particular area, give the government advice. But my view of those expert committees is that they are there to serve government, and if you need them to come together very rapidly in this day and age, then I have seen many occasions when it can be done and has been done. And so I think I think it's very important to call early upon those expert advisory bodies who are kind of nationally and sometimes internationally distributed in terms of their expertise, to get you the information you don't necessarily have yourself.
Now, we've heard in relation to the role of administrative civil servants, if I can describe them in that way, that a key part of their role is to implement with impartiality government policy. To what extent, if at all, is that part of the role of the CMO or DCMO to implement government policy?
I think we take a very clear view. I have always taken a very clear view that it is my job to advise government through officials and up to ministers on options and possibly best options for public health policy in certain areas. But in terms of the implementation of the policy, that really rests with, first of all, the civil service policy officials, and then the organisations who are charged with delivering that on the ground.
Can I turn a little to the relationship between the CMO, DCMOs and ministers? Again, I'm talking in general terms here.
Yes.
And if I ask you, first of all, pre-pandemic, so perhaps the more typical pace of interaction with ministers,
Yes.
How much contact pre-pandemic would the CMO, DCMOs typically have with ministers in the Department of Health and Social Care?
Yes, I'm glad that your question separates out the likelihood of contact of our office with a minister in peacetime, as it were, as opposed to what became the battle rhythm during the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. So I would say, and of course, as a DCMO, it's not my job to track the diary or the movements of the CMO, but I would feel that Dame Sally, in a typical week, probably had contact with ministers more days than she didn't in any typical week. And certainly, you know, I can't speak for her, and I can't speak for her diary managers, but my sense would be that it would be never less than 3 times a week, and probably more than that.
And as DCMO pre-pandemic, to what extent did you have regular interactions with ministers?
In terms of things other than kind of, you know, informal brushing on the corridor and going home at night and so forth, then I would say I was probably, in that short period for the first 2 years, up with ministers twice a week, something like that. But that's different to whether I felt through the CMO and through the permanent secretary I had access to ministers, because I never once felt that if it was important enough that I didn't have access to ministers, but absolutely properly and correctly through the chain of command that takes me to the Chief Medical Officer, to the Permanent Secretary and to the Minister.
And it would, I think, probably be very obvious to understand that during the pandemic, and perhaps sometimes more than others, but during the pandemic, the contact between the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Medical Officer's deputies and ministers was near constant?
Near constant.
To what extent is the CMO, DCMO role a proactive one? In other words, issues, concerns, risks that you think you need to advise ministers about or senior policy civil servants about? Or to what extent is it reactive? You're asked to input onto the public health implications of a proposed policy?
So I think I would say both, absolutely both. I don't think I can give you a percentage as to how much of it was proactive and how much of it was reactive, but certainly it was very much a considered part of the role that if we picked up something, if I picked up something that I was concerned about, my first port of call would always be about getting some facts, clarifying facts, after which it would be a discussion with the Chief Medical Officer, and it would be his prerogative to approach the Minister in company with the Permanent Secretary or directly according to his choosing and according to the urgency. but I didn't feel there were any constraints on that at all.
And what degree of autonomy does the DCMO's office have? If I can perhaps put it this way, you've told us about the role in giving advice.
Yes.
Does the DCMO have a decision-making capacity, or does everything that the CMO perhaps wants to publish or report on have to be cleared through departmental officials?
Right. So the CMO function is statutory, and it is an independent advisory function to government, and so the CMO is always independent and can take an independent view, and has in the past taken an independent view when necessary, and communicated directly with the public when necessary. But of course, in terms of, good order, if you like, and smooth running of government, the normal channel is to coordinate things with the Minister's office.
Should the advice which is given by the DCMO to ministers generally be published, do you think?
I don't really think I have an answer to that question.
Did you ever have a sense during your time in the department that there was an expectation that ministers should be told what they wanted to hear, or was it very much freedom to spell out difficult, inconvenient, problematic areas to ministers?
There are ways and craft skills associated with how one, as an advisor, communicates difficult material to ministers. But my personal view is that I would never give a minister what they wanted to hear. I would only give them what I felt was my responsibility to give to them in terms of candid advice, however unpleasant or uncomfortable that experience might be for me. And I can't say it ever was particularly, but I was always ready for that. And I think it is the role of an advisor to give absolutely candid advice to ministers, of course diplomatically and politely, because if you don't, then how can the minister make a balanced decision?
We've heard from politicians giving evidence, former ministers giving evidence about matters, say, in the 1980s, that it might be unthinkable for them to reject the advice that was being given to them by their chief medical officer. Was it your sense during the time you were in the department that ministers were largely deferential to or accepting of the advice they were given, or was it much more a question of probing and challenging it?
I think ministers are right to probe and to test their understanding of what is being presented to them in the science or the medical space. But ultimately, there is a very careful selection process that has, gone into finding the finest in the land to be the chief medical officer. And it would be quite difficult for a minister to disregard the advice given from the most senior public health official in the country or the head of the UK medical profession.
This is a hypothetical question, so again, I'm not asking you about any specific decisions or actions.
Sure.
In principle, if the CMO or DCMO is is concerned about or unhappy with what the department or ministers have decided to do or perhaps decided not to do in circumstances where there are implications for public health, are there steps open in principle to the Chief Medical Officer or DCMO? Or is that simply something that they have to accept and stay quiet about?
I, like you, have not seen that tested, but I do believe that as independent advisors to the government, and with it being a statutorily established independent office, we would have the perfect right, as the CMO's office, and the CMO would have the perfect right to say something different, and indeed, if necessary, to say something different to the public.
Can I then turn briefly to the relationship between the CMO for England
Yes.
and the CMOs for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland? And just, again, divided into pre-pandemic and then pandemic times. What degree of interaction or relationship was there pre-pandemic between the 4 CMOs?
Yes, so I was called into a meeting of the 4 UK CMOs periodically by Dame Sally and then by Sir Chris. I can't say how often they met, that would need to be scrutinised through diary management, but it wouldn't follow that I was necessarily at all of those meetings. I might have been elsewhere, but if there was something specific that I'd been asked to brief on, then I would be there. But I very much got the impression that there were formal and a lot of informal contacts almost all of the time between the CMOs in the devolved administrations and the CMO England based in London.
Would it be right to understand that it's a relationship of equals? In other words, that each has equal status and authority?
It is absolutely the case that the point would be that the shared understanding of the problem, the shared framing of public health risks, etc., could be dealt with in the days of the devolved administrations in a slightly different way by each of the 4 nations acting on advice from their chief medical officer. Yes, but it would be quite unusual for the UK CMOs to disagree on a point of science or clinical principle. There might be some operational differences in terms of how, working with their own administrations, they went on to operationalise the fine detail. But I have never seen any fundamental disagreement with the kind of public health principles in a particular situation. And when we got into the pandemic space, then I think there was this kind of constant network of phone calls between the UK CMOs, between the DCMOs of the devolved countries, and myself and Dr. Harris when she was DCMO, and it became a kind of extended team, and there were formal meetings of the CMO team in that crisis, the UK-wide CMO team, at least weekly.
Can I turn then to the kind of guidance that the CMO's office might issue
Yes.
to clinicians and NHS bodies? So we've seen examples in the inquiry of types of material that are issued. There's the annual report produced by the CMO. There are dear doctor or dear colleague letters that we've seen. What's the typical form of communication to clinicians or to NHS bodies that you have experience of during your time?
Yes. So when it comes to communications to physicians, that is a communication that every doctor in the land needs to see, then I have certainly seen those come out from the Chief Medical Officer's office, and in almost all cases that I can recall, they have been agreed with the other devolved administration CMOs, and quite often they've been jointly signed letters or maybe very slightly altered letters issued by individual CMOs. But that line of communication that I, CMO, as the head of the profession, are speaking to my colleagues out there on the front line is something that could happen. That is rather different from operational instructions to NHS bodies, where I think the preference is always that the NHS should communicate through NHS England, in the case of England, to the NHS bodies. And there is it doesn't feel right and proper for the CMO to intervene in terms of command and control within the NHS system. It is much better handled, and it's much more comfortable for everybody if it can be handled through instructions from the NHS to the NHS through its own management structures, if that clarifies a bit.
It does. And is there any restriction on the kind of matters that the CMO's office can make the subject of a dear doctor, dear colleague letter?
I don't think there's any formal written rule about it, but the CMO is only going to ever pick out big matters to make communications to on that level. Would not, for example, write to individual patient cohorts. That would be putting another doctor in an existing doctor-patient relationship, and would not be our preferred way of doing it. It would always be through the clinicians responsible for managing patients, or to the extent possible. If there was an issue of needing to get a wider message to the public in general, then obviously a letter is not the best format, but the CMO certainly could and would communicate through media channels to the public on a given issue, as the CMO's office did all the way through the pandemic.
And if there is information, and again, this is a hypothetical, I stress, if there's information that the CMO's office has about a new disease, a disease that would potentially impact not on the entire public, but on particular patient cohorts, so patients with a particular kind of condition, for example. But it's a new disease, individual doctors, individual clinicians working in the field may not have access to the kind of international data that the CMO's office would have access to. What would be the best channel of communication in those kind of circumstances? Would it be to each member of the medical profession, or would it be liaison through NHS England? Yeah.
So we're talking about something here that does not affect the whole public, I think you're saying, but affects specific patient cohorts. Possibly a recent example is the monkeypox outbreak, which largely happened after I left the DCMO post, but was an outbreak that has largely so far been confined to men who have sex with men. And under those circumstances, there are networks of clinicians who are best placed to contact those groups. There are charities, there is the UK Health Security Agency, who can also issue its own materials, and that is more likely to be handled through those channels rather than the CMO saying something to everybody.
In terms of clinical practice more generally, so not a risk of a particular disease or the risks of a particular treatment, but say issues that cut across all areas of clinical practice, such as the importance of informed consent. Are those matters which the CMO's office, to your knowledge, ever gets involved in giving guidance to the profession as a whole?
Well, the example you've given of informed consent is one that is, I think, so hardwired into our system. I can't really imagine a circumstance where the CMO would need to write about informed consent. It's really kind of a lived experience at every level of healthcare. So I can't see that. Could you repeat that? Have a go at rephrasing the question?
Well, can I give you
I sense I'm not quite getting at what you're trying to get from.
Let me give you a specific example of an issue in relation to which touches on informed consent. There was a review published not long ago, the Cumberledge Review, looking at sodium valproate, a range of pregnancy tests, and meshes. So a relatively recent review, and one which highlighted continuing issues with a range of different areas of clinical practice, but one area was the extent to which proper advice and information about risks were being given. So one would like to think informed consent is hardwired into every clinician, but this was, for example, a relatively recent review which indicated ongoing problems in that regard. Now, I'm not asking specifically about what the CMO's office did or didn't do, or whether it did anything in relation to that review, but if that kind of issue were to come to the attention of the CMO's office, in principle, is that something that the CMO might get involved in as head of the medical profession, if he or she understands that there are problems with some of the most fundamental aspects of the doctor-patient relationship?
I think it's possible, if there are problems that can't be solved via other routes, that a CMO could make a decision that it's so important that every physician receives the instruction from them that they would write. But in the example you've given, this is a prescribing matter, and it's far more likely that the MHRA would seek to write to prescribers to remind them of the need to consider the label of valproate and make sure that there had been a discussion of the potential adverse events with the patient prior to prescribing. So what I'm trying to say is that the way I've seen it work, that this isn't a chosen route for the CMO to go large on something. It's where there is a more sane and obviously connected route within the existing kind of healthcare management leadership system, it is better to use that.
Now, I'd been asking you in particular about the route of providing advice, guidance to clinicians or the NHS. You touched in your answers on the question of giving information to the public, the patients at large. What's the importance of that role for the CMO's office? And if we start pre-pandemic?
It could be important in some circumstances, but it's a big thing for the CMO to address the public and say that there's something that we want to, inform you about, warn you about, and it would have to be proportionally big for that to happen.
We obviously saw during the pandemic, as you've already alluded to, press conferences and so on involving Sir Chris, involving yourself, involving
Yes.
Dr. Harris. Was that something new then?
I think it was. Yeah, I think at the scale and frequency that it happened, it was something new.
There are a number of more general patient safety initiatives of fairly recent origin in the UK, and if I just give a couple of examples in relation to England, there is now a national patient safety strategy, a national patient safety committee, and there's the healthcare safety investigation branch. To what extent does the CMO's office, or to what extent has the CMO's office been involved in those initiatives, do you know?
I'm not aware of the CMO's involvement in those. I would say that one of my colleagues during the pandemic period was the Director of Patient Safety for the NHS, and was, I suppose you'd say, kind of onboarded as a third Deputy Chief Medical Officer during the crisis, and had the same status as the other DCMOs, absolutely. But his background was as Director of Patient Safety within the NHS.
Going to turn to ask you just a little for your thoughts on how best to communicate information effectively about risks to public health. First of all, do you have any general observations or thoughts on how that is best done?
Yeah. Okay. So I think I would say that proportionality is very important, and you have to make sure that you've arrived at a very considered view with input from many experts about what it is you gain from communicating risk to the public, and how you are doing it in a way that is proportionate. There being harms and benefits from doing so, and the harms relate to setting hairs running and getting people to panic about something when they shouldn't, where calm reassurance is required, and sane quantification of the true likelihood of risk, as it were. But equally, it is sometimes important to alert people. And the other principle that I personally bring into this is that when you communicate a risk to members of the public, you have to do so in language and on terms that they will understand, and in a way that they can translate that into the lived experience of their lives, which may be very different lives from the lives you lead, and give them information for action, or yes, to an extent, information for understanding, but they have to be able to say, I see what this means for me now, and I also understand what the level of threat is to me, and what it is reasonable that I do about it. That's how I approached it during the pandemic.
And where there is uncertainty, or there may be gaps in the available evidence, gaps in knowledge, how important is it, in your view, to spell out those uncertainties and those gaps to the public?
Well, I think it's extremely important to be candid with a patient and with the public about what you as a physician know at this point in time and don't know, and what the range of uncertainty around the current situation is. Yeah.
You spoke about what might be the downsides of public communication being the need to avoid instilling panic. To what extent is a concern about anxiety or a desire to reassure a part of communication of information about risk?
Can you have another go at that?
I can try. We've, again, from time to time, the evidence the inquiry has heard has talked about the, from a clinical perspective in terms of communicating information about risk, not wanting people to be anxious or being concerned, to give a message that is reassuring, that allays anxiety. Does that objective have a proper role in the communication of information about public health risks, or is it an overly paternalistic approach?
I don't think the desire to put risk into its proper context and to start to frame likelihoods of particular things as very low, I don't think they're ever excuses to not communicate and not to explain that we don't know, we think some risk of something is very low, but nevertheless we are telling you about this rather than just saying, kind of platitudes around kind of, don't worry. I think it's important just to be utterly straight.
Again, one of the issues the inquiry has been exploring, looking at decision-making in earlier decades in the field of public health, has been the role of something called the precautionary principle. And we've heard evidence to suggest that certainly by the 1990s, the precautionary principle, which had its origins in environmental decision-making, was a principle that had become part of the public health landscape. So the idea that you may adopt precautionary measures even when the evidence about the hazard or harm is uncertain. What's the role of that principle in public health decision-making today, in your experience?
So I think the precautionary principle does exist, but I think every decision is considered in terms of the harms and the benefits and the kind of likelihoods. I think it exists, but I don't think it's a kind of blanket rule that if slight doubt exists, then we always take extreme measures. I think it is more carefully quantified these days on an individual situational basis.
So it would be a question of its relevance and its application may depend upon the extent of the uncertainty about the evidence and the seriousness of the harm.
It would depend upon the extent of uncertainty, the seriousness of the potential harm, what could be done about the potential harm, and what it was important for patients and the medical profession to know.
And as a principle, is this principle something that is consciously articulated in public health decision making, or is it again really just hardwired into the way in which public health decision makers approach their decisions?
So I can't say I've ever once kind of reached in my kind of theoretical textbook in my head and say precautionary principle applies here, but I can say that I have said the consequences of this. Perhaps I'm thinking now about the EpiPen shortage that the UK had a few years ago. The consequences of being in that situation where your EpiPens don't fire and you're in the middle of an anaphylactic reaction are pretty grim and pretty serious for that patient. Therefore, even if there is a only likely, and I can't remember the figures, 1 in 10 chance that the device would fail, that is still a 1 in 10 chance. That is not something that I believe people shouldn't know about and that we shouldn't take action about.
We talked earlier about the role and importance of external advisors,
Yes.
Expert committees and working groups. Based on your experience both of sitting on some of the key working
Yes.
groups or committees and your experience in
Yeah.
the department, what makes an effective
Yes.
expert committee?
So I've always taken a view when leading and chairing NERVTAG, the New and Emerging Respiratory Viruses Threat Advisory Group, that we are brought together as a group of experts, independent experts, by the government, using taxpayers' funds to bring us together, and therefore our customer is the government. And it is, I made it very clear to officials when I became chair of NERVTAG that they were to kind of set the homework, if you like. I did not want to chair a committee that pontificated in a slightly abstract way about respiratory virus threats, reserving the right to look at something if we wish to, even if the government hadn't suggested it. But I did want to be led by the committee being useful to its customers, the government, and helping the government solve live policy questions of the day. So very much being open to being requested, will you please take a look at such and such, to which the answer would always be yes. So if that helps a bit, I very much see the advisory committees as serving the government in their independence, of course, but nevertheless serving the government. And I took a view myself that whilst the kind of notional commitment was to meet, I think, twice a year in peacetime for NERVTAG, that was probably the TOR said something like that, if the government or the nation required it, we would meet at very short notice and as often as was required to solve the problem. And that ethos with NERVTAG was absolutely followed through by my successor, Sir Peter Horby, and I have literally lost count of the number of times that NERVTAG met during the pandemic to advise the government.
And how important is it in terms of the constitution, the makeup of such committees, to have a diversity of view rather than and again I'm talking in general terms here, but rather than people who all perhaps think about things in the same way?
Yes. So diversity of science viewpoint is always good, as is diversity in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion principles, as is geographic representation. I never think it's a good idea to have an advisory committee, for example, of the great and the good from just the London hospitals, for example. I never think that's very healthy. I don't think it looks right for many agendas. So I like to have wide representation. I certainly like ethnicity and gender to to be wide. I think there are constraints, quite often related to personalities. You've got to have people on your committee who are capable of working collegiately, even if they are, and you want them to be quite robust at times and quite determined in their own views, but to accept that they are one part of the committee and they may not be a majority view on the committee. They are entitled to have their own outlying view, but the committee's got a job of work to do, ultimately, which is to kind of give the government some kind of consensus advice. So, yes to all of that in terms of diversity, but with credible, workable limits on it.
And where there are dissenting views, how important is it that the fact and nature of that dissent is communicated to those who are then charged with making decisions in reliance upon the advice? So
I think it's important that if you have a view that's out of kilter with the remainder of a committee, that this should not be recorded as a majority, as a an entirely unanimous decision, but a majority decision. It should be recorded that there are some specific outlying views related to X, Y, and Z, and I believe the chair should always truthfully report that to the customer being the Department of Health and Social Care. And of course it lies with the individual, who we do not gag on advisory committees in any way, to say in their private capacity as an independent expert what they think if they wish to say it. All that we would always ask is that they do not communicate that as the majority view of the committee, and that they explain very clearly that they are communicating on behalf of themselves as an individual, even though they are a member of the committee.
I'm going to ask you now to look at a couple of pages from a report that the inquiry received.
Yes.
And heard oral evidence from its Public Health and Administration Expert Group. Lawrence, could we go to internal page 21, please? So you'll see on the screen, Professor Van-Tam, the question that was posed, which was about any weaknesses the group identified in the way in which decisions about health policy were made, in particular decisions about the response to emerging health risks. What I want to do is invite your own observations as someone who was at the heart of public health decision making for a period of time on these matters. And then I'll ask you to set out any views you have on any additional strengths and weaknesses. I'm not going to read out what they've said, but I'll do it by topic. So the first weakness that they identified, or concern they identified, was complexity and fragmentation of the National Health Service.
Yes.
What, if any, thoughts do you have on that and its any implications that has for good public health decision making?
So I have thought about this, as you asked me to, and clearly complexity and fragmentation of any system bring a degree of potential problems to overcome. Now, in the particular context in which this text is written, I think the NHS is but one part of the system. That's the first thing I'd say. And I think the NHS, through NHS England, does have its own command and control system that is meant to bring that complex and complex landscape of the NHS individual units together in a coherent way. The extent to which NHS England can do that is something that I'm sure you have already asked NHS England. What I would say is that in the context of responding to a public health crisis, the kind of bit that's missing here is that Public Health England was established in a slightly different way to the Health Protection Agency. Let me begin again. From the Public Health Laboratory Service, which is the forerunner of the Health Protection Agency, and arguably the Public Health Laboratory Service was something central that tried partially successfully to get into local structures because it didn't have any, true legitimacy to do that. The HPA was set up rather differently with local health protection teams within the Health Protection Agency who absolutely did have the right to work with local public health people. And then when Public Health England was set up, and of course now Public Health England has been superseded by the UK Health Security Agency, that kind of direct line of sight from ministers down through the system for communicable disease control incidents was meant to be much better, and I think it was much better. And I have always found Public Health England local teams to be very aligned with communicating with Public Health England in the centre, and Public Health England in the centre being very quick to communicate with the Department of Health and Social Care, and in my particular case, myself as Deputy Chief Medical Officer. So I don't disagree that complexity and fragmentation of the NHS are problems, but I think this only paints part of the picture that actually there is a pretty decent hardwired health protection system that runs alongside the NHS.
And do you have any sense of the strength or otherwise of the lines of communication between the local public health teams that you referred to and the local NHS bodies and clinicians?
What I see is that there's very close working between I keep calling them Public Health England teams because that's what I've kind of come to know them as, but UK HSE local health protection teams and the local authorities that they cover or serve. Yeah, I do absolutely see that. Where I think in any communicable disease problem where it first appears in a locality, yes, let me give you an example. You get a cluster of cases of diarrhea, and this at local level is a probable outbreak of a foodborne pathogen. It is only after a bit of investigative work that it might eventually be discoverable in multiple parts of the country, when at that point you start to say, well, is this a nationally produced food product that has got a very large and wide distribution footprint? We happen to have picked it up in Area A first, but actually it's a national outbreak. Those things always take time to surface, and they take careful detective work. There is just the odd occasion where I think a local health protection team, because of their experience locally and their lack of experience nationally, can initially frame a problem as something that is not worthy of reporting up the food chain, if you like. But by the time it gets to my kind of level, I feel it is something I want to kind of consider for turning into a bigger incident involving the emergency preparedness and response team at the Department of Health and Social Care. That's not a decision I take alone, that's a PERM-SEC decision. But I think there is that slight delay sometimes in working out that actually this is big and this is significant. But I'm really only talking about a matter of, days here. I'm not talking about things that kind of, grown on for months and years before they come to national attention. I'm absolutely not. I hope that gives you a fairly complete answer.
Yes. The second, perhaps related point identified in this part of the expert report was the continual reorganisation of the NHS, and the particular concern you'll see expressed there is that impairs the ability of those working within it to develop structures and processes that cut across silos. And again, it's perhaps fair to point out the siloed nature of the NHS was another theme in the Cumberledge report. Do you have any observations about that?
Look, reorganisations always just take some time to get used to, particularly in a complex organisation such as the NHS. It isn't automatic that those reorganisations, even if they create short-term turbulence, it isn't automatic that they, necessarily work in the direction of, interfering with coordination of decision making. Reorganisations can make things better too, but they are unsettling and they take time to bed down, and there are always risks in the transformation that, cracks and barriers appear and the occasional ball gets dropped. It's the same with any organisation that goes through a change, and yes, it's a general truism. Nobody wants continual reorganisation, and I guess that's I kind of argue. I wouldn't argue, but I'd say it's quite subjective about what continual reorganisation means.
The third concern identified here is about difficulties of communication across government and between the devolved nations. Again, any observations you have as someone who was within the Department of Health and Social Care at a key time on that theme?
Yeah. So I have considered these in advance, and this one I just utterly refute. In my experience, I have lost count of the number of times when, one of the private secretaries has said to me, have we told the other CMOs yet? Or I've said to them, when are we going to get this particular piece of information into the next UK CMOs meeting? Or is it something that I need to write to them about this evening? Or does Chris want to do it? That kind of thing. So I actually refute that.
So I note the time. Perhaps the moment for the mid-morning break before I continue.
Yes, well, let's take a break then until 11:45. 11:45.
Thank you.